In today's episode, we go over some of the most gruesome shark attacks on humans ever recorded. From a mother and daughter being ripped apart during a vacation together, to a surfer who was attacked by two great white sharks at the exact same time. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are the most horrifying shark attacks you'll ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction. It was whale migration season off the coast of Western Australia. Drawn towards their migration route, great white sharks are known to head northwards to meet the returning whales. This is often when the whales are most dangerous, as the shark population swells and they prowl the coastlines in greater numbers. One of the things known about great white sharks, and that is they are solitary hunters. They don't hunt in packs, a behavior that has been documented in other shark species. But that was about to change as passionate surfer 29-year-old Bradley Smith entered the water on July 10, 2004. From Shoalwater, 41 kilometers west of Australian state capital Perth, Bradley and a group of friends paddled out into the Indian Ocean. They were surfing at Left-Handers Beach, south of Gracetown, near Margaret River. The beach is a popular spot and is considered safe for more junior surfers. Nobody could have predicted what happened that day. As Bradley and his friends lay on their boards, floating on the surface of the ocean, not one, but two great white sharks prowled below the waves. Cooperative hunting is not documented in great white sharks, but these two clearly had their eyes on the same prize, the silhouetted figures of the surfers above them. After swimming along the coastline, the two sharks began to swim up through the water column. They headed directly for the surfers and began to power towards the surface. Bradley's friends looked over to see the terrifying shadow of a great white shark. It was so enormous that they described it as wide as a car. It was the megalodon of modern times, and it was heading straight for Bradley. Before anybody could get out of the way, there was suddenly an eruption of water right beside Bradley, and he was thrown off his board. The shark that made the hit was estimated to be 4.5 meters, almost 15 feet long. But that's when the group of friends spotted a second shark. When Bradley hit the water, he knew what was coming. He knew he had been struck by a shark and desperately grappled to get back onto his board. But the sharks were in attack mode. As the smaller of the two, at 3 meters, 10 feet long, circled Bradley whilst he splashed in the water, the other came in for the kill. Its dark shadow torpedoed below the other surfers heading straight for Bradley. His friends could only look on in horror as the dorsal fin sliced through the surface moments before it opened its jaws just feet from where Bradley trod water. Seconds later, the shark grabbed him, and he was pulled under the surface. The sharp, serrated teeth dug into his flesh, holding him in a vice-like grip. But Bradley was an incredibly brave young man and refused to give up. He thrashed around in the shark's jaws, hitting it and kicking with his legs. Miraculously, he made it back up to the surface as the shark let go for a moment. But Bradley wasn't dealing with just one shark. He was dealing with two, and the blood that now poured from his open wounds incited the marine predators, and a feeding frenzy ensued. At that point, there was so much commotion in the water, so much splashing and bubbling and boiling, that it was impossible to tell which shark was attacking Bradley. It was a desperate fight for survival, and a devastating thing for his friends to witness. His mates, still on their surfboards just feet from where Bradley was being attacked, implored him to escape. With every fiber of their bodies, they willed him to make a break for it. "Swim for your life, mate," they shouted. "Swim for your life." That's exactly what Bradley was trying to do. But as each of the sharks came at him again and again, he couldn't fend them off. He kept punching them with his fists and pushing them away as their snouts broke through the surface right next to him. But it was a losing battle. One of his friends rushed to the shore and ran out of the water to call for help. He dialed 000 and turned to look back at the sea, shocked and shaken by what he had just witnessed. Seeing how enormous the sharks were and how intense their attack was, his friends knew Bradley was in the fight for his life. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The two sharks had been on the hunt, and they had settled on Bradley as their prey. It was such a rapid and ferocious attack by two absolutely giant sharks that at one point, when one of the sharks opened its jaws to bite Bradley, an eyewitness described the jaws as wide as the length of a man's arm. The shark could have swallowed Bradley whole. With both great whites furiously biting, tugging, and pulling at the young man, his body was practically torn in two. After 45 seconds of relentless attacking, there was a break in the feeding frenzy, and Bradley's body floated on the surface, motionless. His friends seized their opportunity. With the two man-eaters just feet away, they frantically paddled over to Bradley, who was now surrounded in a dark cloud of red seawater. Bravely, his friends grabbed hold of him. He was no longer moving. He no longer had any fight left in him. He had bled out from the attack just yards from dry land and only feet from some of his best friends. As the friends pulled Bradley towards the shoreline, he left a trail of blood behind them. It was tantalizing for the two sharks, and the short paddle to the beach felt like an eternity as the friends thought that they might be next. Not daring to look behind them, they focused on the shore and the safety of the beach. Finally, they made it to the shallows and dragged Bradley out of the water. With the friends too traumatized to describe Bradley's injuries, another eyewitness told media that Bradley had been torn in half. It's something that you may see in the movies, but you never for 1 second think that it is something that is going to happen to one of your best friends. Bradley's board was brought to shore afterwards. It had been completely snapped in half by the shark's razor-sharp teeth. The bite mark was testament to just how massive the great whites had been. Following the harrowing tragedy, marksmen in a flotilla of boats who were accompanied by a police helicopter scoured the ocean for the two man-eating giants. Normally, great white sharks are protected, and it is forbidden to hunt them. But fisheries officer Tony Capilouti said that if a shark poses a significant threat to humans and has attacked before, then officers are always authorized to kill it. As the search party headed out into the surf, there was no sign of the two sharks. They had likely been scared off by the sound of the engines and the commotion. But there was dispute amongst many Australians. As is often the case after an attack, the debate about whether or not to kill those responsible arose. Shark nets that are installed along some stretches of the Australian coast are not considered effective and pose significant risk to other marine life. Authorities worry that if a shark has tasted human blood, then they may be more likely to attack people again. But a few days after the attack, words of support for the two sharks were spoken by the most unlikely of people, Bradley's brother. He said that a revenge killing wasn't going to bring his brother back, and it's not what Bradley would have wanted. An uneasiness came over locals when a week passed and no sign of the two enormous sharks was found. They had vanished from the coastal waters, and with the ability to travel more than 100 miles a day, the search area was now huge. Marine experts were surprised by the behavior of the two sharks. Eyewitnesses reported one shark knocking Bradley off the board and the other coming in to attack him. It seemed like a collaborative hunt, something else that added to the uneasiness of the locals. But for most avid surfers, the terrible attack wasn't going to stop them going into the water. When the very same beach was reopened following the tragedy, surfers were back out in the waves. They knew the dangers, and their love for the sport far outweighed any fear they may have of being eaten by a shark and meeting their own final affliction. Maurice Phillips left from Narua Wahia, situated in the Waikato region of New Zealand, and made the almost 2-hour drive to Auckland. Maurice and Rian were both 24, and they were planning on spending the weekend in Auckland, staying with some of Maurice's relatives. Narua Wahia had lots of rivers and streams that the friends frequented with their kayaks almost every weekend. But by now, after 2 years rowing together, Rian and Maurice knew the tributaries like the back of their hands. They knew the best fishing spots, and quite frankly, it was getting boring fishing in the fresh water. Auckland had a wide open ocean, and the fit young men wanted to see how far they could push themselves out on the open waters. The rivers and streams were fast, exciting, and offered a lot of rapids for a kayaker to navigate. That held its own attraction, but neither of them had ever gone out with the intent to fish in the open waters before. The fish were bigger and harder to reel in while keeping your balance, so the outing was almost sure to be a challenging one. Besides, it was nearly Christmas, so they wanted to see if the girls at the beach were prettier than the ones back home. They took Friday off work and arrived in the early morning, spending the whole day looking for good places to set out from. Auckland has its fair share of rowing enthusiasts, so there were plenty of places to choose from. They even tried out the waters that afternoon, just to see how the currents were different and what to expect when you hit a small wave. At the end of the day, they decided to set out from the harbor, where the waters had the fewest waves. The waves died down as soon as you got a few meters in, but that first stretch of choppy ocean was an unfamiliar experience for both. So they decided that it was best to choose the calmest place they'd come across on that first day. They headed to bed early, after being piled with third helpings from Maurice's aunt's excellent cooking, and rose before the sun was even up the next morning. They'd left the car packed with their kayaks and fishing gear the night before, so they only needed to get dressed and take their packed lunch before leaving. Maurice's aunt was kind enough to pack a cooler full of refreshments and a huge lunch for them the night before. There was so much food that they had some of it for breakfast on the way to the harbor, and when they couldn't eat any more, they still had 3/4 left of Tupperware to devour later that afternoon. The sun had risen by the time they got to their destination, and the air was still chilly when they lowered their crafts into the shallows. Each would man his own kayak. There wasn't much room already, and what little space each of them had was taken up by bait and tackle boxes. Rion had a rocky start. He nearly capsized twice before they were even out of the harbor. Every time he hit even the smallest swell, his kayak wobbled dangerously. But it was all smooth sailing once they were out past the ships and yachts that were anchored behind them. Nevertheless, they made it out and had their lines in the water in no time. There were a number of other kayakers on the outskirts of the harbor, a lot of them retired individuals who still had enough oomph in them to keep themselves fit. A few old-timers stopped to give the young guns some advice on the fine art of fishing, and their advice seemed to work fabulously. Soon, Maurice's bucket was overflowing with the shiny silver bodies of fish. The older gentleman sure knew what they were talking about. They still had a long day left on the water, so he decided to throw some of the smaller ones back into the ocean to make some room for a few, hopefully bigger fish. That was a terrible mistake. The fish, all with bleeding wounds left behind by the hooks that grabbed them up, attracted an even bigger fish, a 10-foot great white. She'd been skimming the water for a while, unsure what the fiberglass shapes of the kayaks above her were. At first, she thought they were sea lions, but they moved a little too strangely to be sea lions, so she held off hunting them just yet. The smell of blood that Maurice was chucking over the side of his boat was enough for her to throw all caution into the wind. Something alive was bleeding, and she wanted a piece. Her streamlined body moved through the depths, straight at Maurice's kayak. She opened her mouth to grab the closest fish that were about to swim back into the deep. But her speed was such that she rammed right into Maurice's craft. Like lightning, a dark shape rose out of the water, right in front of Maurice. Before he could comprehend what was happening, the kayak tipped sideways, throwing the man and the contents of his boat into the water. Maurice's head went under just as he uttered a scream. When he came up, Maurice made for the upside-down kayak, and he was close enough to reach it in just a few strokes. His hands immediately clawed at the hull, attempting to pull himself up. He was so frantic to get out of the water that the warning screams from Rion did not even register in his ears. Maurice started to pull himself out of the water, but his relief was premature. Before he could swing his leg up and out, it was yanked down from beneath him. Maurice's grip on the kayak stayed firm, but the immense heave from below just pulled his head under again, and he flipped the kayak the right way up before being torn off the hull. Rion was there, screaming for help. He momentarily saw the gray creature's tail, and he tried to strike it with his oar. It was too late. As soon as the fin and tail appeared, it had already disappeared beneath the darkness, taking Maurice with it. Below, Maurice was being dragged down. He could feel the muscle and skin tearing away from the bone, being ripped and shredded as the animal's teeth sliced at him. The pain was unbearable, and he opened his mouth in a desperate and silent scream of agony. Water flooded his insides, and the air he released went up, where Rion saw the red bubbles break the surface. His hysterical yells had almost a dozen boaters and kayakers racing toward them. Maurice's body was being pulled left and right. The creature was thrashing him ferociously, tearing away at his left thigh. All the while, she was dragging Maurice deeper and deeper. His lungs burned as much as his leg, and whether it was from a loss of blood or oxygen, Maurice's consciousness was beginning to fade to black. He was under the water for a full 5 minutes before his body bobbed to the surface just a few feet away from his kayak. He came up right in front of an elderly couple in a motorized boat who were racing toward the circle of locals who'd come to the rescue. But the rescue was too late. The old man fished the younger one out of the sea, with his wife grabbing his belt to keep him from falling overboard with the weight. The shark had gotten away with half of Maurice's thigh, severing the main artery. She'd bitten in so deep that the stark white bone was visible, even through all the blood and shredded muscle. Rion had somehow managed to stay upright in his kayak throughout the whole ordeal. But when he saw his friend's blank, staring eyes, he keeled over backwards and fainted right into the canoe of a middle-aged man who'd stopped next to him. The people of Auckland took both men to the shore, where one was taken to the hospital and the other to the morgue. The animal didn't return to the harbor, nor was she sighted there again. The usual rowers decided to take a break that Christmas. It was well into the next year before any of them were brave enough to board their vessels again. They all knew the man-eating great white shark was still out there, waiting to bring another innocent person to their terrifying final affliction. Kimon Bisogno and Diego Malesi met 13 years ago on a beach in Ibiza. It was love at first sight. Kimon, a South African native, spoke English, and Diego could only speak Spanish. But even though they could barely understand each other, they made it their mission to learn how to communicate. And what better way to do that than over their shared love of cooking? After Kimon returned to South Africa, the two remained in touch, with Kimon learning to speak a serviceable Spanish, and Diego took classes that helped him become fluent in English. Diego was the one to make the big move across the seas, moving to one of South Africa's biggest capital cities, Cape Town. Together, they opened their little corner pizzeria, Fernando's Pizza. In between busy shifts and a rich social life, they carved out the time to run a soup kitchen that served the poverty-stricken communities across the city, and Kimon worked closely with the Rainbow House organization to fight homelessness in Cape Town. To say that the two were loved in the community would be an understatement. Kimon and Diego were loved by the rich, by the poor, and everyone in between. Almost everyone knew them by name, and if there was an event, whether that be charitable or a sporting event, they were almost always counted on the guest list. Together, they had a daughter, Luna, and Kimon, now in her mid-30s, was planning on trying for just one more baby before she reached her 40s. But the COVID-19 pandemic threw a wrench in their future plans. Together, the happy little family braved the storm that hit the world, and once it was safe for business to commence as usual, they hit the ground running. Like everyone else, they had their plates full trying to salvage their business, to reopen their soup kitchens, and now that Luna was starting kindergarten, the school runs and sporting events took up a big chunk of their time too. 2022 was an exhausting year, and the family decided that they'd take a short break in September, just as spring came to southern Africa. The big holiday season would start in December, and with all the preparation that they needed to put in before that time, this would be the last chance that they'd get to catch some of the new warmth that came with spring, and the rush to make up for lost time hit them in full force. Plettenberg Bay was 300 kilometers away, but the 4-hour drive went by quickly enough. The warm weather brought a handful of out-of-season holiday-goers and surfers to the resort town. During peak season, the place is packed to the brim, more so than the other coastal hotspots. But in September, it was just full enough to add a little excitement to a weekend away, but not so much that the overcrowded streets and beaches became claustrophobic. The family spent their first afternoon unpacking their luggage at the resort that they booked into, and they took Luna out to play in the shallow pools with her fishing net. After they'd caught a handful of tiny fish and picked up a shiny shell or two for Luna's collection, Diego and Kimon picked up some takeout on their way back to their hotel. Luna was fast asleep by the time they pulled the car in, and Diego carried his daughter to her bed. They decided to let her sleep. She'd like her chicken nuggets just as much for breakfast in the morning. Saturday dawned even brighter than the day before, and all of them were itching to get back to the beach. Diego offered to stay behind so that Luna could finish her nuggets and have that bath that she missed out on the night before. So Kimon headed off to the beach, along with the other early risers at the resort, planning on meeting them there later. The resort's beach was just a 10-minute walk from their chalet, and Kimon didn't even bother to take her phone or any belongings besides her towel with her. She and Diego fully expected to see each other again within the hour. September in the area also brings its fair share of juvenile sea lions that have been weaned from their mothers and are finally old enough to venture out into the water on their own. Inevitably, this influx of the inexperienced prey also brings in the predators. Just 3 months ago, there had been a fatal attack on a human from a great white right on the stretch of beach where Kimon was swimming. The warning signs and red flags were long gone from the sands now, and the country had all but forgotten about the tragic event. Besides attacks being incredibly rare, the oceans also have nets spun around popular swimming destinations to keep the bigger fish out, and a slew of observation vessels that are constantly scanning the surface for sightings. How the 14-foot great white managed to slip through the nets and the searchers' sharp eyes is still a mystery. It literally came out of nowhere. Kimon was amongst 20 or so other swimmers, and there were 4 surfers in the distance riding the rather low waves. There were at least 10 people who were deeper in the water than she was. Kimon was only standing waist deep in, watching the riders attempt to catch a decent wave. The only explanation is that the shark came from as deep as the water allowed it to go, and it applied the usual tactic when storming into a colony of sea lions. Great whites hurl themselves into the middle of the pack and bite down on the one who just happens to be closest to its jaws at the time. Whatever the case, one moment Kimon was standing with her back to the sand, with Diego and Luna walking towards her, and the next, an enormous gray beast reared out of the water directly in front of her. Its mouth was already open and geared to strike before it even broke the surface. Kimon didn't stand a chance. There was no warning, no time to even think of turning to flee. The predator sank its teeth into her, engulfing Kimon's upper body whole. Only her head and legs remained outside its jaw. Diego, who'd had his eyes on Kimon when it happened, grabbed Luna and stuffed her face into his chest to spare her the gruesome sight that was playing out before them. The group around Kimon scattered, knocking each other out of the way to reach their children and to make it out to safety. The shark took Kimon like she weighed nothing, viciously throwing her from side to side. One older gentleman launched himself at the screaming woman. What he planned to do about the dire situation, no one knows, but it didn't matter. The shark's head slammed into him, sending him flying several feet away. His equally gray-haired wife grabbed him and pulled him out. As the water turned red and the people fled, several people called emergency services, and Diego could only stand watching as the love of his life was being ripped to shreds. Before the last of the hysterical swimmers were even out of the water, Kimon stopped screaming, but that didn't stop the animal from tearing at her. It let go, swimming off with a chunk torn out of her abdomen. After making a wide loop, just long enough to swallow, it struck Kimon's lifeless body again, this time making away with a piece of her left thigh. Diego couldn't take it anymore. He shoved Luna into the arms of the elderly woman who'd helped her husband out of harm's way. Diego was about to enter the water himself. It didn't matter that she was already dead, or that he stood a good chance of dying himself if he dared to go in, as long as he could get her out. The old man saw what he was about to do, and despite his bruised ribs and his age, he grabbed Diego and held him back, yelling at him that his little girl shouldn't be orphaned completely. Diego didn't hear a word of it, and he continued to struggle to get out of the surprisingly strong old man's grasp. The other swimmers came in, huddling around Diego. They kept him from going into the surf towards certain death, and that's where rescuers found them just 7 minutes after the attack occurred, with Diego weeping in the center and the ravaged body of Kimon floating in the shallows. The shark had disappeared, satisfied with what it could get from Kimon, and it was never seen again. The poorest streets of Cape Town went into a deep mourning. The homeless and the impoverished went on a spree to steal flowers from homeowners' gardens in the more affluent parts of the city. And now, even 2 years later, Diego and Luna still find a bouquet of flowers most days of the week when they go in to open the store for the day, a constant reminder of Kimon and the day she met her terrifying final affliction. March 22, 2014 in South Africa dawned bright and warm. Summer had just winded down the month before, and even though it was technically already autumn, that year the heat hung around long enough for just a little while longer. The Austrian group of tourists that landed down had chosen this time specifically. Early autumn is still warm enough to enjoy the beaches, but not so blisteringly hot that their light European skin would suffer in the African sun. Right on the very tip of the country, bordering the Indian Ocean, lies the small holiday town of Port St. John's. The Indian Ocean is much warmer than the sometimes freezing Atlantic Ocean that lies on the other side of the country. And as you can imagine, it's along this coastline where most of the swimming, surfing, and snorkeling happens. The beaches are almost always packed, unless it's in the dead of winter. And even then, there are always a handful of die-hard surfers still willing to go out into the waves. As popular a destination as Port St. John's is, it's not very well patrolled. The reality is that, of all of South Africa's nearly 3,000-mile coastline, every single inch of it is swarming with deadly sharks. Places like Jeffreys Bay, the Durban beaches, and Hartenbos are just busier and require the most attention. Port St. John's is not exactly on most tour groups' lists of hotspots. It's mostly frequented by locals, so it doesn't get as much traffic as the rest. You won't see any lifeguards here, and patrol vessels are at a minimum. Only the shark warning signs that dot the beach gives any indication that there might be any danger here. But in fact, it's one of the country's busiest breeding grounds for the colossal man-eating bull sharks. Had this group of Austrians, mostly made up of retirees, known this, maybe they'd have sought out another beach to cool off in. They only came to visit the iconic African safaris, the easy mountain trails, and they wanted to try out the local cuisine. But as soon as they landed, all of them decided that it was a good idea to find some water before heading inland to see the wild animals. Even along the coast, and in autumn no less, the heat was getting to them all. Frederich Burgstaller and his wife Margit practically threw themselves at the water when they arrived. The rest of the group were a little hesitant to get in themselves, not for fear of any danger. Instead, they found the packed beach a little claustrophobic. At 66, Frederich was still an excellent swimmer. He just needed to get past the first few shallow waves, and he'd be out of the crowd, where he could stretch out his arms and swim in the ocean that was virtually empty after those first few yards. Margit was content to roll up her pant legs and wade in the surf up to her ankles and watch her husband weave through the dozens of youngsters and families who were having an absolute ball, splashing and playing. All of the feet treading through the water was kicking up so much sand that there was virtually no visibility. The water just looked mucky and brown from above. But even if someone had been sharp enough to see a hint of the gray body that was stalking the swimmers from below, the noise of the beach would have dampened any shouts of warning. The animal had been moving just out of reach, hoping to hone in on one person in particular. But the mass of moving limbs was confusing. Every time it decided on a target, the whole mass of people's patterns shifted, and it had to start hunting all over again. That's until Frederich stepped into the water. Just as he got in up to his waist, he turned around to wave at Margit. Those few seconds he spent to stand still was enough for the shark to focus on him, and his stark white skin didn't help the situation much. Among the bodies and the shades of brown and black around him, Frederich stood out like a beacon in the murky water. It's almost no surprise that he was the one that the predator finally got a lock on. Poor Frederich was doomed the moment he set foot in the water. Frederich turned back to face the open sea, getting ready to dive headfirst in to catch some speed to swim out even farther, when the beast reared out of the dark. Frederich stumbled back, but it was too late, and the shark was too close. It grabbed him by both of his legs and lifted the man clear out of the water. It was like an explosion. One moment all was well, and the next there was absolute chaos when the animal and man burst out of the water, scattering the crowd instantly. Flecks of red and blue showered the people as they ran and shoved each other out of the way. The sudden uproar of stamping feet, splashes, and panicked screams were so deafening that it drowned out Frederick's own screams of fear and pain. The upsurge of chaos was so bewildering that the shark's jaws slacked for just a moment. That was all Frederich needed to rip himself free. Pushing with his hands against the animal's snout, he could feel the razor-sharp teeth tear through his skin as he pulled himself loose. In the instant that Frederich was free, he turned and began to run on his torn and shredded legs, but his limbs just couldn't hold him up after the beating that they just took. Frederich went down before he even took 2 steps in the direction of the retreating crowd. The beast was on him again. Horrified, Margit and the crowd saw Frederich pull back to throw a punch. He would have hit the approaching 2-meter-long monster square in the nose, but almost like it had been anticipating this very reaction, the shark opened his mouth just as Frederick's fist shot forward. His arm sank into the deep and dark gullet right up to his shoulder. And yes, the shark bit down, taking the entire right arm clean off the socket. Lifting his only remaining arm, Frederich attempted one last time to land a punch, but with legs that didn't work and a spewing hole where his right arm used to be, he simply sank beneath the surface with a final spray of blood that was swallowed by the water. Huddled on the sands, the crowd huddled in terror, no one daring to go into the vicious splashing that was happening just yards from them. Helpless, they were forced to watch as the shark fed on Frederich right in front of their eyes. Margit, hysterical, attempted to run into the surf, but 2 South African teenagers stopped her from running to her death. She struggled so fiercely that one of the boys, a 19-year-old, had to push her into the sand and sit on top of her to keep her out of the water. He begged for her to stop, while the other boy grabbed her hand, promising to stay with her. The terrible scene went on for another 15 minutes before the waters finally became still and there were no longer any signs of violent splashing. And only then did emergency services arrive. But their only job now was to fish what was left of Frederich out of the water and to get the traumatized Margit to the hospital. That young boy held onto her hand until the ambulance doors closed and he was left standing on the beach, watching the ambulance drive away. Another vehicle took Frederick's remains away. Besides his right arm, Frederick's entire lower body was gone, and most of the organs in his abdomen had spilled out too. You'd think that such a gruesome death would mean the end of swimming at Port St. John's. But no, less than an hour later the surf was full of people again, none of them even aware of the terrible attack that had just happened in the very waters that they were swimming in. And even now, 14 years later, there are still no lifeguards or boats patrolling the waters. just a handful of signs that stand crooked and rusting in place to warn swimmers of the danger beneath the waves, until someone else is inevitably taken by the gray monsters that lurk beneath the surface and meets their own terrifying final affliction. The ancient ama divers of Japan have a history that stretches back 3,000 years. Back in the day, it was reserved for women only, but in the last 100 years, a few men have entered into this profession too. They dive for pearls, shellfish, and mussels. Even back then, the profession was one that was highly prized by the royals, and their tables were almost solely supplied by the ama if seafood was on the menu. The dedication, fitness, and skill that needed to be applied was of such a high standard that only the best of the best made it in the industry. It's said that the ama divers had the longest lifespans in all of Japan, and that's saying something coming from the country that boasts some of the highest life expectancy ages in the world. It's not uncommon to see 70-year-old ama divers who are every bit as active in the industry as their younger competitors. The divers traditionally wear white when they're in the water. This choice of clothing is made for very practical reasons. It deters sharks. When the predators are looking up from below, the white cloth is almost indistinguishable from the daylight sky above the water. That's also why most sea mammals have white bellies. It's the best camouflage that nature can provide. Besides their white tunics and loincloths, the ama divers wear nothing else. As recently as the 80s, most ama dove bare-chested, and keep in mind, most ama are women. There's a reason that they're called the mermaid divers. No scuba gear and no oxygen tanks. These are the original free divers, masters of their craft. Like his predecessors, Kazuto Harada could stay underwater for twice the length of time than the average human could. He and his two colleagues specialized in shell diving, especially the highly prized abalone that fetched the highest price at the docks. Even the American and European restaurants and the elite members of society sent their vessels over to Japan to get their hands on the rare delicacy. Kazuto and his two companions were some of the very few men who became ama. But then again, their mothers were all ama divers too. They were raised on the water, and it was only natural that they would follow in their parents' footsteps. Kazuto and his two companions, Akira and Ken, had their own fishing vessel equipped with modern radios and engines. They were some of the first ama divers to take a more modern approach to the occupation. Make no mistake, the skills needed to go down 30 feet with only the air that your lungs can hold were still every bit as old school as their ancestors honed. But the large, domed diving helmets and neoprene suits definitely made the icy water more bearable, and it allowed them to see more living treasures hidden amongst the crevices. The neoprene suits aren't the skin-tight diving suits we use today. They're much more loose-fitting and light, allowing for more mobility and weight. The fabric that soaks up the water, coupled with the weighted stones tied to their belts, helped the ama reach the bottom much faster and more smoothly. All three men were on edge. The last 2 weeks had news of shark sightings, and even one fatality in the area. Every time a fin was spotted breaking the water, the radios would spread the news and location between the boats. None of the vessels were equipped with radar or the high-tech whistles and cogs we have today, so they relied on word of mouth to keep everyone in the loop. Word had spread that the great white that caused the fatality of another ama diver was at least 16 feet long, and the sightings after the attack was almost certainly the same shark. The morning was cold and overcast. Not that the temperature bothered the men all that much. They'd trained in freezing waters all of their lives, after all. Ken kept the radio within earshot as he fed the ropes tied to Kazuto and Akira down below. Every few minutes, one of the men would resurface with a bag full of crustaceans and shellfish. Ken then loaded the haul into their coolers before handing the empty bag back so that it could be filled all over again. So far, the morning had gone well. Their coolers were filling up nicely, and they would probably be able to go home earlier than usual if they got half a dozen more good dives in. Akira exited the water and took over from Ken, while Ken got ready to enter the water to take the last shift. Kazuto wasn't quite done yet. At 41, he was the oldest in the group, but he was by far the most experienced, and he had the most stamina. He dumped his latest catch and took another breath, sinking down into the depths once again. From behind his fishbowl helmet, Kazuto could see the rocky bottom, covered in seaweed, and even from up high he could already spot the next clump of abalones suctioned on the side of a boulder. Their pearly blue shells sparkled merrily in the dim light from above. Kazuto's lungs were full, so he took his time pulling them off their anchored homes. But behind him, a predator had been lurking for the past hour. The very great white that had killed a female diver just a week before. Like it did with her, it observed the men first, staying just far enough so that they couldn't see it. It knew that it had exactly 2 minutes before the man resurfaced again. If it were going to strike, it needed to do it now, while he was alone. Kazuto's back was turned toward the deadly missile that torpedoed at him through the water. With his mind, hands, and eyes busy trying to pry the stubborn shells off the rock face, there was no way that he could have braced himself for the impact that was about to hit him. He was slammed into the rock in front of him so hard that he didn't even feel the teeth piercing his suit. His face struck the rock, cracking his screen and flooding the suit with water. The animal reared back, tearing the fabric and Kazuto's back to shreds as it went. Kazuto screamed into the salt water, the bubbles from his mouth rising silently to the surface. The shark began to swim toward the deep, with Kazuto held in its jaws, but the rope around Kazuto snapped tight, almost pulling it out of Akira's hands. The sudden resistance was enough to tear Kazuto free. Akira acted quickly when he felt the sudden jerk. He knew that Kazuto was being attacked by something down below. He didn't wait long enough to see the explosion of red bubbles breach the surface. He just dug his feet into the hull of the boat, pulling with all his might and screaming for Ken to help him. Together, they pulled their friend in. Kazuto surfaced, miraculously still alive and conscious, though he was leaving a trail of blood that turned the water red behind him as he was pulled toward the vessel. But their moment of relief was short-lived. Just as Ken reached out to grab Kazuto's already outstretched hand, the beast was back. Like some bizarre scene from Jaws, it sailed out from the deep and snatched Kazuto right in front of their eyes, bearing him back down into its aquatic playground. The men gripped the rope and started pulling again, but with one strong shake, the shark ripped Kazuto right out of his already shredded suit. The sudden lack of resistance sent Ken and Akira plowing backwards so far that they nearly landed in the sea themselves. Hoping that the animal just lost its grip, they reeled the rope in as fast as they could, but there was no weight to it at all. They knew, before the remains of Kazuto's ripped suit surfaced, that Kazuto wouldn't be inside it anymore. That tattered suit was all that they had to bring back to Kazuto's family. They never found his remains, but that didn't stop the shark from coming back. After 2 successful kills, it was now actively searching the shoreline for more ama. But the ama's willingness to embrace the new ways meant that the message was spread far and wide across the radio channels. Every single diver evacuated the water for 2 whole weeks, leaving the animal to search in vain until it finally became so hungry that it retreated back into the deep ocean to find food elsewhere. These 2 weeks weren't just effective at getting rid of the hunter. It also allowed the ama divers across Japan's shores, from the north to the south, to pay their respects to their fallen comrade. Kazuto's mother, who was still an active diver at the age of 71, and his sister, also a diver herself, received the remains of his suit and used it instead of his body to complete the appropriate funeral rites as best they could. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had to bury. The only thing left of Kazuto Harada is the horrifying story of his terrifying final affliction. It was November 13th, 2004. The harbor at Cock Bay in Fishhook, Cape Town, South Africa was noisy and busy with the influx of people readying for the day ahead. It was still early in the morning, just before the sun had fully risen, but the fishermen were already out and about. They knew that the reduced daylight provided the perfect cover for a good catch. After all, Fish tend to seek shadows and hiding places, feeding in the peace and quiet of the early morning. As the men chattered away at the harbor, they secured their gear and equipment by the boats, ensuring they had everything necessary. Cock Bay Harbor was a few kilometers away from Fishhook Beach, a white sand beach popular amongst surfers, kayakers, and tourists. A tight-knit community, as the seaside village was mostly home to local retirees and families. It is undeniably one of the most popular places in Cape Town. When everything was ready, the fishermen began their journey a few kilometers from Cock Bay Harbor toward False Bay, where fish were waiting for them. A sliver of daylight illuminated a portion of the sky, giving it a reddish, early morning glow. The fishermen were just in time. Reaching the designated fishing spot, the fishermen turned off their engines so as not to spook the incoming school of fish they had carefully prepared for. The weather was great. The fresh southeast winds blowing over the calm currents of False Bay carried with it the salty scent of the sea. The fishermen readied their nets for casting as the fish scrambled in groups, swimming across the ocean a few meters underneath the boat. In complete synchronicity, they threw the nets and let them sink toward the school of passing fish. Moments later, they pulled it toward the surface to reveal their catch. One glance at their nets, and they knew something was not right. Among their catch was a bunch of fish called white steenbras. These powerful, hard-fighting fish can kick up a lot of commotion. If a group is somehow caught in a net, they can make the water look like it is boiling from how aggressive they shake. Steenbras were also protected fish, so the fishermen knew they had to release them immediately. However, the vibrations caused by the fish were enough to catch the attention of one of the most feared fish in the sea. A great white shark suddenly emerged from the depths, exposing its formidable head to the surface, looking for the injured animal causing the commotion in the water. As the fishermen saw the shark, they released the steenbras back into the sea. The shark was curious but quickly turned uninterested. It roamed around the area for a few minutes and then eventually swam away, parallel to Fishhook Beach. Realizing that the shark was heading toward the popular beach where various people were swimming, the fishermen immediately took action after releasing the steenbras. They headed straight toward Fishhook Beach and began waving a red flag. This was to let the people swimming on the beach know that they spotted a shark around the area. Immediately, the people got out of the water and there was no incident. The next day, on November 14th, Fishhook Beach prohibited people from entering the water. However, throughout the day, no sharks were spotted in the area, so the authorities decided to open the beach for swimming again the next day. This would prove to be a fatal decision. November 15th, 2004. Although it was a Monday, a workday, many people roamed Fishhook Beach, taking advantage of the clear, cloudless morning. The somewhat chilly winds blew strongly from the south. However, it was weak enough that smaller waves with foamy crests did not appear at False Bay. The waters were unusually warm and calm today and lacked their usual swell. It was 7 a.m. and Tyna Webb was at the beach, dipping her toes in the sand. She was preparing for another swim at False Bay. Although she was fully aware of the warnings from the previous day, Tyna was not bothered at all. To her, this was simply another day among her frequent visitations to the beach. After all, she had been swimming here 6 days a week for 17 years. It was inevitable that Tyna would end up frequenting this place. Since moving to Cape Town with her husband in 1987, they fell in love with the place and made it a habit to visit the beach during their free time. However, when Tyna's husband died, she had been living alone in an apartment at Sunny Cove, a place 5 minutes away from Fishhook. Tyna would visit the beach alone in the mornings and go for a swim a couple of 100 meters away from shore toward the deeper parts of False Bay. Although her friends warned her not to stray too far into the ocean, Tyna was a bit stubborn and would never listen to them. After all, she was an incredibly strong swimmer who had a lot of experience. Unfortunately, today was different, and no amount of experience could have saved Tyna from what was to come. Arriving at the beach, Tyna walked across Jagger Walk, a famous coastal footpath following a curve of granite boulders and rock. This is an actual image of Tyna taken by a photographer who happened to be at the beach on that same fateful day. After meandering for a bit, Tyna was ready to swim. She entered the water and quickly began making her way into the deeper parts of False Bay. Tyna found the ocean disarming, even though she had seen every stone and corner of Fishhook Beach in the past 17 years. Tyna never grew tired of the place. Visiting the beach and dipping her toes in the sand became a normal part of her everyday life. Tyna swam through the waters and eventually stopped at a spot approximately 60 meters off Jagger Walk. She did one of her favorite maneuvers, the backstroke, and continued moving toward the deeper waters of False Bay. Unwittingly, she was heading toward her demise. The same giant great white shark that was spotted a few days ago appeared near the end of Cock Bay. Sensing the presence of Tyna, it swam toward her, attracted by the splashing from her backstrokes. The massive creature cocked its head from side to side, sizing up the 77-year-old from under her. Unfortunately, Tyna hadn't the slightest idea of the predator underneath her. She was too busy admiring the birds flying through the morning sky. In one swift motion, half of the shark's body emerged from the waters. The creature lazily opened its massive jaws and clamped down on Tyna with its rows of razor-sharp 6-inch teeth. The poor woman was defenseless against such a powerful predator as it squeezed her torso into its mouth. The deep blue color of the water turned red as Tyna was slowly suffocating by the pressure of the shark around her body. It shook her left and right as if it were barely even trying, until finally Tyna broke loose from the shark after a chunk of her ripped away into the shark's mouth. The shark thrashed around while chewing on the piece of meat from Tyna's body before swallowing it whole and returning for more. Tyna, who was bobbing in the water in pain and barely hanging on to consciousness, struggled to remain afloat. The creature swam swiftly toward her once again and clamped onto her body. There was nothing she could do. With Tyna between its jaws, the great white shark took her under the water and swam into the depths of the ocean, where she likely would have drowned before the shark could finish her off. The water eventually went calm, and amidst the dissipating cloud of blood was Tyna's red bathing cap, floating on the surface where Tyna had moments prior been peacefully swimming. Many people saw the incident happening. After all, about 30 to 40 people were swimming at Fishhook Beach that morning. However, the attack occurred so quickly, nobody had time to react. Before anyone could do anything, Tyna was already gone. Tim Atkins, in a car high on the mountainside, was one of the witnesses to the attack. I suddenly saw a shark coming at great speed from the Cock Bay end of the beach towards where the woman was swimming, he said. The shark hardly slowed down. It just hit her, and the water was full of blood. It made 2 turns, grabbed her in her side, and pulled her under the water. The shark then turned and headed out to sea. I think it had the woman in its jaws. 2 National Sea Rescue Institute rescue craft were summoned to search for Tyna. Additionally, a helicopter was dispatched to the scene. During this search, the helicopter pilot spotted a massive great white shark swimming near Fishhook. He noted that it was larger than the helicopter and the biggest great white shark he has ever seen. Authorities speculated that the shark was around 6 to 7 meters in length. Like most apex predators, the great white shark typically uses its bite as a way to test potential prey. In most shark attacks from great white sharks, the victim usually sustains injuries from a single bite, as humans aren't typically on the shark's menu. However, in Tyna's case, the shark returned for Tyna after its initial bite, leading authorities to believe she was targeted as prey and she would most likely never be found. Eventually, the search for Tyna was called off by the afternoon, and the beaches were closed once again. Just like authorities predicted, Tyna's body was never found, and all that was left was her bathing cap, which washed up on shore, identified by her son-in-law in the subsequent investigations. Undoubtedly, the shark attack on Tyna Webb was tragic. However, shark expert Dr. Leonard Campagno director of the Shark Research Institute at the Ezekos South African Museum, surmised the event logically. An attack is always a possibility unless you don't go into the water. This was a risk Tyna had taken every day in these waters for 17 years, which tragically resulted in her final affliction.